So I'm sorry that we have to start looking at a photograph. This piece is usually here, but there's a special exhibition, so it's been taken out and put in the exhibition. You now have to pay to see it. And in February it'll be back here again, and you don't. But it's a really, really useful piece to help us get our minds attuned to the sort of timeline of biblical and secular history, if you like. And we're going to start, as I say, way back in Egypt. Don't worry about the stuff we walked through. We're going to see that in a minute. There's some really important pieces there. But this is a sequence of Egyptian dynasties. So we call it a timeline, but of course there's no time on it. There's no dates or anything like that. The Egyptian pharaohs weren't so interested in dates, but in dynasties, keeping their dynasty alive. This piece, if you can see the original, it was put together, commissioned by the most famous pharaoh of all, who is?
Ramses.
Great, lovely. Ramses the Great, Ramses II, okay? So he's about 1250 BC. So he's 3,25,000 years ago. So to be fair to him, he's done a pretty good job, because you have to remember, and this is the second shock of the day, when Ramesses put his history of Egypt together, there was no Google. Right? Yeah, such a world existed. There was no Google, no Wikipedia. So to be fair to him, he's done a pretty good job. And he goes right back into ancient history, 2,000 plus years BC. Fortunately for us, the bit that is most intact is the most interesting piece for us, which runs from here, this way, along the timeline, and ends with Ramesses himself. So these two cartouches here, the shaped pieces here, they are Ramesses. And it starts here in about 1,900 years BC. And works its way towards him. And that's the whole point for him, by the way. He's only interested in himself. All of history has been leading to him, which is why all the cartouches along the bottom, they're all Ramesses. Okay, so everything's been building up to Ramesses the Great. And he's done a good job, because that's what we call it, Ramesses the Great. Obviously, the further back you go in history, the more flaky and gappy the history becomes, because he doesn't know about some pharaohs. And clearly, if you think that's nearly 700 years of Egyptian history, there's not enough pharaohs in there to fill that timeline. But it's not bad. But the interesting thing for us is, the closer you get to Ramesses, the more gaps appear. You would think it would be the other way, wouldn't you? The further away, the more gaps, the closer, the more complete the record is. And that is not because he doesn't know about pharaohs. It's because he knows about them, but he doesn't like them. And in the Egyptian way of viewing history, if you don't like something or someone, you never write it down. You never, ever carve it in stone. So you know that expression, maybe, do you? Is it carved in stone? Well, it comes from this idea that as long as these cartouches exist, the history of all of these pharaohs continues to live. But if he leaves you out of his history, he is not only sort of ignoring you, he is trying to delete you from history itself. I'll just give you a couple of sort of identifications. You see here, there's a cartouche. It's got like three sort of hands up motifs here with a sun, Ra, there. That is Pharaoh Sesostris and Wasrit. I'll tell you about the names later. He's about the right time for Joseph in Egypt. So you're thinking of a mental chronology for your Bible, 1900-ish BC, Joseph in Egypt. He's there. And then we have some others here. There was one with a horse's head here. Here is Pharaoh Akhmos, and he is most likely, and I'll hopefully explain to you as we go through the morning, the Pharaoh of the oppression. He begins the oppression of the Israelites in Egypt. And then you come through to here, this one with the beetle, the little castle, and the sun. That's Pharaoh Tutmos III. And he's very interesting, which we'll think about. And his successor, with similar sort of beetle, sun, and so on, Amenhotep II, who was probably the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and I'll show you why I think that a little later on. And then we work our way through to Ramesses, jumping over about 5 gaps now. He's missing 5 people from the list. Have you heard of a pharaoh called Akhenaten? Anyone? Akhenaten? Good then. Hey, we're learning already, aren't we? We're learning already. So Akhenaten, if you ever see him, he's very distinct in carvings and so on. He has got a long, stretched face. He looks very weird, and he has a sort of a pot belly, a giant stomach usually, and anyone stood near him also has to have a giant stomach. Nobody really knows why, but this is how you recognise Akhenaten. But Akhenaten is the guy heading up in this period of history who wakes up one day and says, look, we worship lots of gods, polytheism, okay? But we're not going to do that anymore. We're just going to worship one God, and his name tells you who that God is. So his name is Akhenaten. Aten is the God we're going to worship. You can do that if you're Pharaoh, that's not a problem. But what is a problem is when you then send your people out to the temples of the other gods and tear them down, which is what Akhenaten did. And the problem there is, the people are looking at this thinking, wait a minute, my granddad used to worship Amun or Tot or whatever it was, and suddenly their temples are being erased and deleted and torn down, and there's chaos. He moves the capital of Egypt to a place called Amarna. He upsets everybody you can possibly think of. Okay? So Ramesses, when he comes to do his history, he doesn't like that whole period. He hates it. And so he leaves Akhenaten out of the list. And in fact, what they also do, and I'll show you some great examples of that as we go round, is if there was then previously a record of Akhenaten, a name, or a carving, or a cartouche, they would then go back and check on all of these other sculptures, and if his name is there, they would then erase it, they would carve it out and delete it completely. And every time you do that, you sort of push him further and further into the background of history. Okay, that's all well and good. Who's the second most famous pharaoh in all of history? Got the first one right, so it's a good start. Who's the second most famous pharaoh in all history? You do know it. Don't make me say it. Yes, thank you. Tutankhamun. Okay, Tutankhamun, you've heard of him? Seen his treasures, his mask and everything? Okay. He's famous because we found his stuff and it's amazing. But interestingly, he's not in Ramesses' list and he belongs to this time period again. Why is that? Because he is Akhenaten's son. He wasn't born Tutankhamun, he was born Tutankhaten. Okay? And at some point in his young life, he sort of says, as much as I love my old dad, that was a huge mistake about the Aten thing. So what does he do? He sends his people out, they rebuild the temples, they put everything back together, he moves away from Amarna because that's the place associated with the heresy. He relocates the capital of Egypt, he puts it all back together and everybody goes, oh boy, whew, we're glad that's over. So here's the question for you, because this is really important to get this before we do anything else today. Here's the question for you. Tutankhamun is putting everything back as it was. Solving the problem, sorting it out, making everybody happy again. Why does Ramesses leave him out of the list?
Because he wants to come out
It is an obvious assumption, but in this case it's not the answer, okay? Yeah? Right, I'm just going to go and grab a coffee. I'll come back in.
I want the people to remember that God and how is restoring.
Right, exactly. That is exactly the thing. You see, if you're deleting history, you have to really think about that because, you can't just delete the event. You've got to delete anything that might relate to the event. So Ramesses' problem is, if he puts Tutankhamun in his list, people like me will stand here and will bring the whole horrible mess back to life. Because he is the one who repaired the damage that his father Akhenaten had done. And this is very important to understand, the Egyptian mindset here, because it will be relevant to us thinking about our Bibles and Bible history, okay? This is exactly how they think. If you don't like something, you never write it, you never ever carve it in stone. And then what you have to do is spend the rest of your life worrying in case there's a reference to it somewhere else. And so they were experts at deleting every possible sort of reference to something like what's called the Amana heresy. And it's interesting, of course, that at this time period, Akhenaten becomes monotheistic, and a lot of people would make more of that in terms of post-Exodus, because it's not that far from the Exodus. And I don't know is the answer. I don't know, but there has to be a reason why Akhenaten suddenly decides to be monotheistic rather than polytheistic. I don't think he was entirely monotheistic, but he wanted to focus on the art, which is one of the chief gods anyway. Okay, so it's really important. Why is it important? Well, because you will hear it said, there is no record of the Exodus in Egyptian history. And the answer is, well, of course there isn't. Because the Exodus, you know, if it took place, it's a historical thing, was a massive humiliation for the pharaohs of the time. They are never going to sit down. What do we expect to find? You know, some pillar, some monolith, you know, some inscription on a temple saying, you know, there's dead frogs everywhere, dead children. It's never going to happen. Never, ever, ever, because the goal of any pharaoh and any of his entourage at that time would be to erase every possible reference to a significant humiliation like that. In Egyptian literature and also in the rest of the sort of Middle Eastern literature, you never get the situation where a king, pharaoh, whatever it is, sits down and records, I had a terrible day today. They never had bad days. They never lost a battle. They never made mistakes and they never got stuff wrong, because the history we read about them is the history that they wrote, okay? And they never wrote the bad stuff. So it's really, really important to get that. And also then compare your Bible, particularly Old Testament, particularly way back, you know, the books of Moses or whatever, in this same time period. What is that like? Well, actually, it's unique in this ancient literature. What is the Old Testament? It is the record of the failure of the people of Israel to be faithful and obedient to their God. It records all their mistakes, all their blunders, all their rebellion, all their stupidity, all their sin. No one else in the world, I haven't read everything in the world, but I think I can make the statement confidently, no one else in the world is writing like that. If you're writing, you did everything perfectly. You know, you never got anything wrong. So it's really, really important. And that is why, one of the reasons why you get this statement, there's no record of Exodus in Egyptian history, and the answer is, well, of course there isn't. But like we just found with Ramesses and Tutankhamun and so on, what you can't do is you can't erase the other circumstances that take place around an event like Exodus, which I'm going to show you, hopefully, and you'll get some sense of how we're working with that. So that's really important. Does that all make sense?